creatine. Now again, creatine is not just found in supplement form. It's also found, of course, in foods, in particular red meat. However, the amount of red meat that one would have to eat in order to get the amount of creatine is just far too high. You'd be ingesting far too much of other things in red meat that you wouldn't want that much of. And for that reason, I and many other people will take creatine daily. We now know there's no need to so-called load creatine. In the old days, as it were, we were all told that we had to load creatine. We had to take high-dose creatine for 4 or 5 days, and then you could back off to a maintenance dose. Now it's very clear you can just take a daily dose of creatine, and that it really doesn't matter when you take that creatine. Now, the point I want to make about creatine is, for instance, that creatine monohydrate is the most effective form. Fortunately, creatine monohydrate is also the least expensive form of creatine that's sold out there. I see no evidence whatsoever that the other forms of creatine are superior to creatine monohydrate. But what you'll usually hear is that taking 5 grams of creatine monohydrate per day is ideal for everybody. And that advice is simply not well informed by the scientific literature. I discussed this with Dr. Andy Galpin during that series, and one of the things that I've started to do since the closure of that series is to take more creatine per day. So now I'm taking 10, sometimes even as much as 15 grams per day of creatine. And I would give you a very specific formula of X grams of creatine per kilogram or pound of body weight, but believe it or not, no such specific recommendation has ever been published in the scientific literature, at least. And if you look at the studies on creatine, they almost always gauge the amount of creatine to give an individual based on their body weight. So what I'm talking about here is if you weigh 185 pounds or so, okay, plus or minus 5 pounds, out to about 250 pounds, 10 to 15 grams of creatine per day is probably more appropriate for you than is 5 grams. And if you're somebody who weighs, 180 pounds down to, say, 130 pounds, 5 grams of creatine per day is probably sufficient, meaning it's going to be more effective for enhancing physical performance and cognitive performance because, as some of you already know, creatine is a fuel, or the phosphocreatine system is a fuel system for the brain as well. And people fear it's going to make their hair fall out. We already talked about that in previous episodes and the lack of data to support that idea. But if you decide that taking creatine is right for you, adjust the total amount of creatine that you take according to your body weight.